How do we decide who's a good fit for ISTDP? Turns out it's not just about the patient, it's also about the therapist. Today, I want to talk about some key ideas from a Davanloo paper about selection criteria. Who is and who isn't a good candidate for short-term dynamic psychotherapy? The paper is called Evaluation Criteria for Selection of Patients for Short-Term Dynamic Psychotherapy, a Metapsychological Approach from 1978. This is a chapter from the book that's called Basic Principles and Techniques in Short-Term Dynamic Psychotherapy. So this text offers a number of intriguing theoretical considerations on not just patient selection criteria, but really a range of theoretical issues. Davanloo mentions a number of literary references and names of various psychoanalytic thinkers. That should be interesting for those curious about the kind of literature that Davanloo consumed. I'll read sections of the article and share some of my own reflections. I'll share my 2 cents when it comes to the idea of selection criteria itself. You'll see that I'm not quite ready to turn away from those ideas. This paper highlights why there are basically no Davanloo transcripts that have fragile patients in them. You'll hear about the combination of defenses that led Davanloo and his team to refer those people out to get supportive therapy, meaning they were not included in the studies that used short-term dynamic psychotherapy. Also, the idea of primary anxiety versus signal anxiety will be a major focus, as will the idea of the real relationship vis-a-vis the transference relationship. You'll hear Davanloo discuss the idea of crises, different types of regression, healthy, unhealthy, and you'll really get a sense for his psychoanalytic acumen. He gets into the importance of the person of the therapist and the need to individualize treatment with the unique elements of the therapeutic dyad in mind. He also spends some time delineating internal and external suffering, and he makes several references to the importance of clarifying Oedipal versus pre-Oedipal conflicts. He explicitly states that we all have some of both, but that there will be a primary area that captures where our psychic structure and main conflicts predominantly reside. Meaning we lean either neurotic or fragile, even though we all have psychic configurations that contain both. Davanloo, he writes about regression versus fixation and how important it is to understand the difference. Davanloo makes several references to object relations and seems quite focused on assessing whether or not a patient's object relations are disturbed or not, whether or not the patient is capable of forming a transference, as opposed to exhibiting signs of a narcissistic neuroses. So I discussed the idea of being able to form a transference as a developmental achievement, indicative of intact object relations. Toward the end of the text, Davanloo shares that he found, him and his team, that therapist capacity for empathy was more predictive of success than the therapist's theoretical orientation. So this and more is what you have to look forward to in this video. And again, this is not going to be a comprehensive summary or analysis of the entire paper or chapter, but instead I'm going to hone in on a few select portions that I think are especially interesting. Also, I think I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the fact that this text refers to short-term dynamic psychotherapy, not intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy. Although these older texts, they refer to either short-term dynamic psychotherapy or broad-based short-term dynamic psychotherapy, and the I for intensive, ISTDP, came later I personally believe that the foundation was contained already in this earlier version of the model. Rapid major mobilization is part of what came later, as did the codification of the graded and psychic integration format. But if you look closely at these older texts and transcripts, you'll see that the work is often naturally graded, and there are elements of psychic integration woven into the fabric of a lot of these sessions. So even though these earlier works do not include major rapid mobilization, the vertical format, I maintain that the earlier work actually contains the foundation and the heart and soul of Davanloo's work. The latter developments and additions were refinements, but I don't think they fundamentally altered the method or the underlying principles. Because of that, you will not hear me make a fuss about the distinction between STDP and ISTDP. Also, before we really dive in, let's talk about selection criteria. The idea that not everyone is a good candidate for short-term dynamic psychotherapy. So to me, this is common sense. The notion that everyone can be helped, let alone through short-term dynamic psychotherapy or intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy or any of the experiential dynamic therapies, that feels a bit manic to me. Now, I know that in later years, Davanloo expanded his approach to work with a much wider range of clients and patients, and I think he did that successfully. With skillful and flexible use of ISTDP and ISTDP principles, especially with things like the graded format and psychic integration, I do believe that we can help a lot of people. I certainly myself almost never turn down any prospective patient, though it could, of course, be argued that I sometimes augment or adapt the method to the point where it's questionable if I'm still doing ISTDP with some. On the other token, I don't succeed with everyone, nor does anyone for that matter. So that's a pretty striking, compelling argument for the idea that not everyone can be helped by ISTDP or even experiential dynamic therapy, the larger umbrella category. So that said, I still think selection criteria matter. Highly skilled, flexible, and humane ISTDP therapists, they can reach a broad range of patients, no doubt. But I don't think we should completely abandon the idea that some patient presentations just aren't a great fit for this approach. There is humility in recognizing that. I also find it helpful to take stock of the selection criteria in terms of signs of hopefulness, things that point to a better prognosis. When a patient meets some of the criteria outlined in this article, this chapter, their chances of benefiting from the therapy are simply higher. So I'm not ready to throw out the idea of selection criteria, even though I get why being too rigid about them can definitely be problematic. The last thing that we want to do is prematurely rule someone out who might actually benefit. But I also think it's important to acknowledge our limits and work within them. Okay, so I'm going to cut to the chase when it comes to just listing the selection criteria that Davanloo referred to. I won't be going into each of these in any depth, so this is just to really whet your appetite on page 14 and 15. They're listed here where you can see I'm hovering and circling the mouse. Okay, it's under the rubric evaluation of ego function, which is under the larger rubric of formulation of psychotherapeutic possibilities, psychotherapeutic diagnoses. Anywho, the list are one, the quality of human relationships, 2, the affective function of the ego. 3, motivation. 4, psychological mindedness. 5, response to interpretation. 6, intelligence. 7, the ego's defensive psychological organization. At the end of the article, Davanloo discusses findings around the correlation of these criteria with successful treatment outcomes. And there was a correlation between most of these except intelligence. Okay, now that I've covered that, let's turn to page 10. So down here on page 10, you can see where this is lighting up, this green stuff right there. Quote, the personality of the evaluator, by that he means the therapist, and his or her style and technique affect to a great extent the evaluation process, the therapy process, which influences the type of patient he or she selects and the psychotherapeutic technique he uses. This speaks to the importance of the person of the therapist and the idea that who the therapist is as a person, it plays a real role in the therapy. I think this acknowledgement also speaks to the importance of psychotherapy trainings that cater to the unique needs of the therapist and make that a real focus. That doesn't really lend itself to systematized forms of teaching, and that can, of course, have drawbacks. But I appreciate the emphasis on making the unique therapeutic dyad the main focus. That's how I was taught by my teacher, and it's also how I approach teaching. That means that two different trainees training with me, they could come away with quite different ways of doing therapy and different ways of utilizing ISTDP principles. This is to account for the unique variables of each therapist and to encourage each therapist to be their own person as opposed to, say, a clone of Davanloo or someone else. Now, having said that, obviously this emphasis on catering to unique variables, it has to be balanced with a focus on learning critical basics and the foundational stuff. So there's an important balancing act to get right when it comes to this. Okay, now we're down to page 22, and I'm going to start reading here. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to start reading here. Among the many variables. Okay, so this is along the same lines. Among the many variables in the evaluation process, the therapy process, are those of the patient himself, his discomfort, his maladaptive neurotic pattern of behavior, his hopes, faith, expectancy, and motivation. So this is a nod towards the unique variables of the patient, the idea of the patient's hopes, faith, and expectancy strike me as particularly interesting. Patient expectancy is a common factor, and it reminds me of Joel Weinberger's paper, Common Factors Aren't So Common, the Common Factors Dilemma. Because in that paper, Weinberger writes about how if a patient expects to get better, that the expectation itself has an ameliorative function. And yet, no school of psychotherapy incorporates expectancy and its effects into its theoretical underpinnings. So that's what Weinberger writes. So I'm also fascinated by Davanloo's reference to faith. I don't know for sure, but I think he means faith in the process, like faith in the therapy. Anyway, back to the article. So here, I'm going to read this bit right now. That is lighting up in yellow. Okay, so back to that. The patient's negative or positive reaction toward the evaluator, meaning the therapist, might be a transference reaction or might be a realistic reaction to the negative or positive attributes of the evaluator, the therapist. See, Davanloo was a realist through and through. So that's a great reminder that not all patient responses toward the therapist are necessarily transference based. Love that. So this is really a nod to the idea of the real relationship vis-a-vis the transference-based relationship. We're not transference machines. We are capable of at least partially perceiving others outside the filter of our past. And we seem to be able to do that the more transference-based feelings that we process and work through. In fact, Davanloo's insistence on preventing a transference neuroses from taking hold through making sure that the transference feelings are acknowledged and processed, and the major focus that he put on genuine emotional closeness and intimacy, and his way of doing away with impartiality by taking a clear, strong stand for health and against resistance. These are all ways of sending an unmistakable message. And that message is that he was all about fostering a real relationship. That's because there can be no genuine emotional closeness as long as two people are not at least partially seeing the other as they are, as opposed to through the distortions of past relationships. His focus on addressing and working through the complex transference feelings, it's totally in step with this idea. We want to mobilize and work through those feelings so that there can be real connection and closeness, unencumbered by distortions, displacements, the transference. This also reminds me of what Davanloo writes on page 22 under the rubric of transference, countertransference, evaluation. And that's where we are, right here, page 22. Yep, same rubric here. Here, Davenport makes the point that a transference relationship is a prerequisite for being able to work out an emotionally intimate relationship. A transference relationship is actually a developmental achievement. And here's what he writes about it. It's right here. There is this quote, there is a close interrelationship between the capacity for the development of a transference relationship and the capacity for object relationships. The greater the patient's capacity for a meaningful human relationship, the greater is his potential for the development of a transference relationship. So, in order to appreciate what this means, we have to understand that people with severe psychological disturbances, they often struggle to form a transference relationship in therapy because their ability to emotionally connect with others is so deeply impaired. Their inner world is too chaotic or fragmented, underdeveloped, often due to primitive defenses, loads of splitting and projection. And yeah, that makes true relational engagement pretty much impossible. Sigmund Freud described these people as having a narcissistic neuroses, which means that the person does not have sufficient object relations to be able to form emotional connections with others. Instead of forming a dynamic, workable transference, these individuals remain too self-absorbed and cut off to engage in any meaningful way. Since transference relies on a person's ability to project relational patterns or templates onto the therapist and then work through them, those who lack basic relational capacity, they won't generate a transference that can be meaningfully analyzed and resolved. And Davanloo, he keeps an eye on this when he refers to signs of, quote, of a disturbed object relationship. Again, here on page 22, a disturbed object relationship. Um, Now let's go to page 15 here. So this is also in line with this idea of assessing the patient's ability to be relational. Down here at the bottom of page 15 is where I'm going to start reading from. Let's see. Quote, the evaluator should determine to what extent regressive changes in the ego have brought about impairment in the ego's capacity for object relationships. For example, in a depressive state, regressive changes in the ego may bring about, this is now page 16, regressive demands for attention, reassurance, and support. Though a careful evaluation, through a careful evaluation, one should determine the developmental failure, which limits the capacity for positive object relations. So this is page 15 and 16, but going back to page 15 again, you can see right here this piece about a give and take relationship. Davanloo, he's clearly referring to the importance of patients being able to engage in a give and take relationship. So, anyway, I mentioned the real relationship, and I think that's central to psychological healing myself. David Malin, I think he echoes this message when he was heard saying that what was broken in relationship must be healed in relationship, or so I have heard from Fredrickson. So anyway, this is going to be a bit of a tangent, but this makes me think of Charles Gelso, who wrote a book called The Real Relationship in Psychotherapy, The Hidden Foundation of Change. This is actually one of my all-time favorite books. Anyway, Gelso writes a whole lot of insightful things about the real relationship. Can't recommend it enough. But one of the things that he writes is that the real relationship is the personal connection that has to do with the degree to which each patient and therapist is genuine with the other and is able to see the other as they actually are. So I know I'm getting carried away here, but I'm actually going to pull up a passage from his book and read it here. I do think it's relevant. So let me just pull that up real quick. Okay, so let's do a quick excursion over here into the real relationship, The Hidden Foundation of Change, written by Charles Gelso. And I'm looking for page 13. Bear with me. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, see here at the bottom of page 12. Gelso is talking about how the two most important components of the real relationship are A, genuineness, and B, realism. And then down here, why do these two elements, genuineness and realism, and I'm on page 13 right here, why do these two elements comprise the real relationship? It is hard to imagine a good personal relationship, one considered real by the participants, in which these two ingredients do not exist or exist only to a small extent. The inability or unwillingness to be oneself, but instead being phony, obviously does not make for a good personal or real relationship. Indeed, it is hard to feel the other is real if he's not sharing himself in ways that seem authentic. In this sense, phony and real are mutually exclusive. As for realism, a person is unlikely to feel that she's involved in anything like a real relationship if she did not feel the other was grasping her in a way that fit her, but instead seemed to fit others, perhaps the perceiver more than her. The relationship would not feel real or realistic and would yield comments such as, "Where are you coming from?" And "I just don't think you have a clue as to who I am." Okay, I'm going to leave it at that, and I will let that speak for itself. Anyway, back to the Davanloo article at hand, or I'll just keep reading Gelso. All right, page 22, down here. This part highlighted here. Okay. Quote, the evaluators, meaning the therapists, the evaluators' variables, his social and professional standing, his objectivity, his value system, his integrity, his clinical maturity, his empathic capacity, his conscious and unconscious needs greatly influence the process of evaluation and selection, therapy and selection. We should take into consideration the impact of countertransference feelings in evaluation of selection criteria. In the process of evaluation, countertransference feelings might affect the evaluation of the patient's motivation. And that is here, finished off here on page 23, top of page 23. So this again goes to the importance of the person of the therapist and to the idea that therapy doesn't take place in some absolute objective space outside of any kind of subjectivity. This means that therapy is not just about the patient's readiness or pathology, it's also shaped by who the therapist is as a person and a professional. Davanloo is, as you heard, obviously referring to countertransference here, likely in the subjective rather than the objective or universal sense, meaning that the therapist's quirks and unresolved emotional conflicts leading to perceptual rigidities. It can skew our perceptions and unduly color the therapist's view of the patient. Speaking of countertransference, on page 23, which is where we are, Davanloo makes the quite interesting point that, quote, if the evaluator is focusing on the central core of the patient's problem, this might increase the patient's motivation. But if, due to countertransference reaction, the evaluator moves away from the focal point, this might decrease the patient's motivation for therapy. So I think that this speaks to the importance of the therapist really facilitating a focus that is on target, focused on the core of the patient's problem, and that the therapist can take their eye off the ball due to their own unresolved emotional conflicts, due to their own resistance against emotional closeness. You could say Davanloo just refers to countertransference here, but I think this would be the same in this context. Also, the therapist can probably take their eye off the ball due to lack of technical skill, not just due to countertransference. That would be my take on it. And while we're on the topic of unique variables related to the unique personhood of the therapist and the patient, I thought I'd read this bit. It's also from page 23, right here, having completed, right underneath this yellow that pops up, right underneath that. Quote, having completed the psychodynamic evaluation with the formulation of genetic diagnoses and the psychotherapeutic evaluation, the therapist is in a position to tailor a specific psychotherapeutic method to the patient's needs. It is a fundamental principle in the field of psychiatry that the treatment should be individualized. Human beings, in their character structure, pattern of interpersonal relationships, and emotional life, are so different from one another that individualization of treatment adds immensely to the effectiveness of therapy. End of quote. Now, if that's not a call to be very focused on case specifics and a word of caution against highly manualized, systematized approaches to learning and doing therapy, I don't know what would be. I'm not able to speak to the idea of whether or not Davanloo himself was always able to adhere to this idea of flexibility in his later years. But it's clear that in the early days, at least, he was exceptionally focused on honoring the need to be case specific and flexible. I think it's just beautiful and brilliant. Now, let's look at page 16, where Davanloo references Freud and the idea of primary anxiety versus signal anxiety. I'm just going to read this whole passage. Let me get to page 16. Yeah, so this is a pretty interesting piece. Again, this is going to be Davanloo referring to Freud and the idea of primary anxiety versus signal anxiety. And again, let me just read it. Starting here, too. The affective function of the ego, the degree, accessibility, and tolerance of affect are of great importance. Freud, in New Introductory Lectures from 1933, distinguishes between two types of anxiety. To one, he gives the name primary traumatic anxiety and states that it is brought about directly by helplessness in the face of overwhelming instinctual excitation. By contrast, he defines the second type of anxiety as a defensive reaction brought about in the face of an internal danger situation. He further states, quote, I can see no objection to there being a twofold origin of anxiety, one as a direct consequence of a traumatic moment, and the other as a signal threatening a repetition of such a moment. End of quote. Subsequently, in Inhibition, Symptom, and Anxiety, he emphasizes, he meaning Freud, the signal anxiety, which threatens repetition and is the basis of the defense mechanism. The clinician should differentiate between a primitive form of externally directed separation anxiety and the anxiety which arises as a signal of internal danger. The second form of anxiety is associated with a higher form of ego organization. In evaluating the capacity of the ego to experience and tolerate anxiety, the clinician should differentiate between anxiety as a stimulating and as an inhibiting factor. In secondary anxiety, the individual experiences some uncomfortable physical sensations but maintains his usual mental alertness with the ability to use his resources to their fullest. Here, anxiety acts as an ally. The opposite side of the picture is the individual who's not able to tolerate anxiety, who shows helplessness, a manifestation of the infant confronted with a situation with which he cannot cope. His mind goes blank, he becomes tremulous, and there is an inability to use his resources in a purposive way. At this point, we see the emergence of what is called primary anxiety. Primary anxiety has its roots in the earliest periods of life. The capacity to experience, tolerate, and master secondary anxiety depends on considerable ego development and mature psychic apparatus. Setzel has indicated that the presence of anxiety, both in childhood and in adult life, is often associated with a good prognosis, and that if, during the course of his development, the individual has been capable of tolerating a great amount of anxiety, he is, on the whole, less liable to develop irreversible neurotic reactions. We know, and I'm here at the end, we know that in psychoanalysis, the clinical criteria emphasize that the ability to tolerate anxiety is of great importance for the resolution of an analyzable transference neuroses. Page 17. In evaluating the affective function of the ego, one should also evaluate the patient's capacity to experience and to tolerate guilt and depression. Edward Burbing, in The Mechanism of Depression from 1953, an ego-psychological approach to depression, proposed that both anxiety and depression are basic ego states. Depression, like anxiety, represents an ego response to internal or external events. Distinction should be made between depression as an affective experience of general psychological significance and as an illness representing a complex regressive syndrome. Setzel emphasizes that the capacity to recognize and tolerate, quote, the existence of an internal unconsciously determined danger situation is very closely linked to the problem of psychological insight, end of quote. She further states that, quote, the experience of depression is a prerequisite for optimal maturation, end of quote. To summarize, the evaluator should determine the extent to which the patient's emotional life is close to conscious awareness, the patient's capacity to experience and tolerate the anxiety, guilt, and depression, which will be mobilized during the interview, his responses to mobilization of the affect, which is latent under the surface. Attempting to mobilize latent affect and evaluate the patient's ability to respond affectively is a crucial part of the assessment process. Evaluation of the patient's capacity to experience and tolerate anxiety, guilt, and depression is an essential task of the evaluator. So I'll just riff a little bit off of this. So I think this is where it becomes very clear that Davanloo is very aware of these different forms of anxiety and the idea that with primary anxiety, the external event plays a major role. This very much reminds me of how later in his career, Davanloo would talk a lot about how negative, corrosive forces could damage and impair a person's healthy defensive system. And when the core of a person is injured, in such a way as to disrupt the workings of a set of healthy adaptive defenses that operate in step with the UTA, that is when primary anxiety and terror states can really run amok, overwhelming the person. Davanloo is referring to an immature psychic apparatus, which is probably akin to a fragile character structure, and an insufficiently formed repressive barrier. But I wouldn't rule out the idea that if a sturdier person suffered a sufficiently traumatic event, this could disrupt healthy defenses and the integrity of the repressive barrier, rendering them vulnerable to primary anxiety and unmanageable terror states. Another passage that highlights both Davanloo's sensitivity to external sources of suffering, but also his psychoanalytic sophistication. It takes place here on these two pages, 12 and 13. This section, it goes into different types of regression as well. You'll see that he differentiates between healthy and unhealthy regression. And I'll just go ahead and read it. Yeah, starting right here, formulation of dynamic diagnoses, psychodynamic formulation right here. Dynamic formulation refers to the evaluation and understanding of the forces that, in the current life of the patient, are operative in producing the patient's difficulties and problems, the external and internal forces that account for the patient's symptoms. Psychodynamic evaluation refers to the evaluation of conscious and unconscious forces and conflicts, social and environmental forces that are influencing the patient and playing a major role in his illness. The evaluator should determine how much of the patient's problem is internal and how much is reactive to his environment, the nature of the patient's underlying conflicts, the strength of his ego adaptive capacities in relation to his life stresses. See, I'm starting this yellow piece right here. It is based on the psychoanalytic theory of psychopathology that neurotic symptoms are the result of an unconscious attempt at a compromise solution of an unconscious, painful intrapsychic conflict or an unconscious conflict within the person related to his external environment. Psychic symptoms are regressive phenomena with an unconscious meaning. They are a compromise formation between the repressed and the repressive forces of the ego, between ego defense and instinctual impulses that are not accepted by the superego. The major tasks of the evaluator can be summarized as follows. Formulation of the way in which an external force, an interpersonal conflict, gives rise to an intrapsychic conflict and anxiety, and of the way in which the defensive operation of the ego attempts to lessen the anxiety. Dynamic assessment of the various structural components of the patient's personality, evaluation of an overall ego function and the maintenance of adaptation, evaluation of the patient's intrapsychic equilibrium and his external environment. And now here, page 13. Evaluation and identification of the presence of a crisis. Parentheses, Freud originally stated that an adult neuroses breaks out when a contemporary life situation repeats a traumatic infantile situation. It is well documented, clinical fact, that the optimal opportunity for successful intervention is at the time of crises. This is the time of greatest fluidity within the defensive structure, and the patient might show the greatest potential for change. It is the time when our psychic apparatus, faced with external and internal challenges and changes, is capable of progressive and regressive responses, as shown in the work of Eric Lindemann and Gerald Kaplan. Regression in a crisis situation is not exclusively pathological. I'll read that one more time. Regression in a crisis situation is not exclusively pathological. This is well shown by Ernst Chris and others who consider regression an essential concomitant of learning and of the creative process. We all know that in the course of psychoanalytic treatment, regression is an essential concomitant of genuine insight. A crisis may be associated with regression, which is characterized by symptom formation, and this, in a potentially healthy person, might bring about the resolution of previously unresolved conflicts and ultimately increase emotional maturity. Maturational crisis should be taken into consideration. Adolescence, with the onset of sexual maturity, might revive unresolved early conflicts and lead to manifest symptom formation. Early adult life, with the demand to choose a profession or a life partner, might lead to symptom formation. Parenthood, with a revival of passive dependent wishes at a time of added responsibility, might be associated with symptom formation. It's important to make a clinical distinction between one, instinctual regression limited to neurotic symptom formation, two, more serious regression, including impairment of the basic ego function, with respect to which the clinician must determine whether it is a setting of crises, and three, insidious regression, which characterizes certain types of psychoses. It's the clinical task to differentiate regression from developmental failure in a patient who comes from a very emotionally deprived background, who has never experienced a genuine triangular conflict. And on page 14, Davanloo makes the point that we need to differentiate between regression versus fixation. with the idea that fixation suggests a far more difficult situation where the person's development was actually arrested at some pregenital psychosexual stage, pre-Oedipal. And that is right here. Here, I'll read it actually. To evaluate the relative importance of regression and fixation, it's essential that the evaluator differentiate between characteristics of predisposed individuals, which suggest developmental failure, and those which suggest significant regression during the course of a psychological illness. And then here on page 17, Davanloo discusses the importance of evaluating motivation in terms of genuine conscious and unconscious desire for change versus motivation based in wishes to satisfy infantile needs. It's right here. It's right here. I'll read it. One should differentiate between a neurotic type of motivation, motivation to enter into a treatment situation, based on satisfying an infantile need, and the kind of motivation that is based on a genuine conscious and unconscious desire for change. And that is interesting. It's a possible dose of realism to temper the impulse towards excessive idealism, the idea that if we are just skillful enough to block projection of will and UTA, then all patients will tap into their will to change. I mean, that's certainly true for a lot of people, but what Davanloo is saying here calls into question that this will work for everyone. So again, a dose of reality here to temper excessive idealism. And now on page 19, under the rubric right here, evaluation of the structure and function of the id. Quote, although the components of both, and both is referring to pregenital and genital, or pre-Oedipal and Oedipal, okay? So, quote, although the components of both are present in all individuals, it's necessary to determine the degree and intensity of fixation at the pregenital developmental period. End of quote. And a little further down, quote, if the major area of the patient's conflict is at the Oedipal genital level, for example, the overall therapeutic prognosis is good. Yet one should also differentiate between regression and fixation, e.g., in a person whose major area of conflict is at the Oedipal genital level and shows regression to the pregenital stage, one is dealing with a situation which has a much better therapeutic prognosis. In general, the more the central core of the patient's conflict is at the Oedipal level, the better the prognosis, despite the fact that in every neuroses there is usually some regression from genital to pregenital. In contrast, the more the central core of the patient's conflict is fixated at the pregenital level, the more problematic is the therapeutic course. End of quote. In every neuroses, there is usually some regression to the pregenital stage. The components of both pre-Oedipal and Oedipal conflicts exists in all individuals, but it is necessary to determine the degree and intensity of each. This points to the idea that people are not one thing. The idea of fluidity in the psyche, and that the psyche is more like a layered onion as opposed to a fixed structure. Again, we're not just one thing. This is the idea that if you dig deep enough in everyone and under a certain set of circumstances, we can all access borderline and psychotic states. Davanloo refers to the, quote, major area of the patient's conflict, which also captures the idea of proportions and proximal location rather than a pinpoint location. Another way to put it is that people lean one way or another, but are not permanently fixed at a specific location. Neurotics lean neurotic because their conflicts and primary psychic structure line up with that area, or that geography, you could say. But this does not mean that fragile psychic configurations cannot surface under the right conditions. Same with those with a fragile character structure. They lean that way, but this does not mean that they cannot sometimes access areas of functioning that are consistent with higher functioning neuroticism. By the way, I wrote about this as a mixed presentation kind of a thing together with Aspasia Karageorge in a paper that was published in the first issue of the Journal of Contemporary ISTDP. And then here on page 18, under the ego's defensive psychological organization, Davanloo writes about an interesting idea, which is the number of ego defense mechanisms available to the patient, and the idea that the more options and flexibility a person has to go between different kinds of defenses, the healthier the person is, the greater the ego adaptive capacity. So the idea that with greater flexibility and greater number of defense mechanisms to go between, quote, the ego is less dependent upon any specific defense mechanism to maintain adaptation, end of quote. And then back to page 19, Davanloo basically mentions that those with defenses suggestive of fragility or lower ego adaptive capacity, they were referred out for supportive therapy. This, of course, explains why there aren't really any Davanloo transcripts that showcase his work with fragile patients. I know he later did end up doing some work using the graded format and psychic integration, but at the time when this article was written, these people were not included, but again, instead referred to other therapists for supportive therapy. And right here, where I am circling the mouse and you see these, this green here light up. Okay, that's where he writes, the following combination of defense mechanisms were predominantly used by patients taken into supportive therapy. Okay, intense reliance on projection, massive denial, major reliance on acting out and dealing with conflicts, acting out combined with projection, and then a few rigid, persistently used ego defense mechanisms. Okay, we're on the home stretch now, page 30. The end of the article goes into Davanloo's observations around response to interpretation and how this is associated with positive outcomes. He cites Alexander from 1957, as saying that when the interpretation includes all three corners of the triangle of person, current, past, transference, it fulfills its twofold purpose, quote, it accelerated the assimilation of new material by the ego and mobilizes further unconscious material, end of quote. Goes on to say that he has noticed that interpretations that include the impulse, meaning the aggressive impulse, are particularly associated with positive outcomes. He also writes that triangle of person interpretations are also, quote, an excellent technique in dealing with resistance in the first interview, and that it increases the patient's spontaneity and motivation for further psychotherapeutic work, end of quote. Then the very last thing that I'm going to share before we wrap up, I find ever so fascinating. It's here on page 31. Davanloo writes, quote, we have been concerned about the subject of motivation and the theoretical orientation of the evaluator. Some of the work done by medical students in the early phase of our research indicates that the evaluation process and motivation are definitely much less dependent upon the theoretical orientation of the evaluator than they are upon the personality characteristics of the evaluator and his empathic capacity. I'll read that one more time. Definitely much less dependent upon the theoretical orientation of the evaluator than they are upon the personality characteristics of the evaluator and his empathic capacity. I think that speaks for itself. So, to wrap things up, in this review, I highlighted how Davanloo's work on selection criteria goes far beyond simply identifying which patients are good candidates for STDP. But this review has also underscored the crucial role of the therapist in all of this. Davanloo emphasized individualizing treatment and fostering the real relationship. And all of this points to a nuanced and deeply relational approach to psychotherapy based in realism. So while ISTDP has expanded to help a broader range of patients, selection criteria remain relevant, not as rigid exclusionary rules, but as markers of prognosis and therapeutic focus. At the same time, Davanloo reminds us that therapy is not just about patient readiness, it's also about the therapist's ability to engage, maintain focus, and address their own subjective countertransference. Ultimately, the art of ISTDP lies in maintaining a structured yet flexible approach, integrating technical precision with deep emotional engagement. Genuine emotional connection isn't separate from transference work. It's the very outcome of fully engaging with and working through transference dynamics. Davanloo's model challenges us not just to apply techniques, but to cultivate the kind of therapeutic presence that fosters real transformative intimacy. Okay, that will do it for now. Thanks for watching, folks. Until next time.